Good morning, everyone. Our scripture lesson is found in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. The message. Hannah prayed, I'm bursting with good news. I'm walking on air. I'm laughing at my rivals. I'm dancing my salvation. Nothing and no one is holy like God, no rock mountain like our God. Don't dare talk pretentiously, not a word of boasting ever. For God knows what's going on. He takes the measure of everything that happens. The weapons of the strong are smashed to pieces, while the weak are infused with fresh strength. The well-fed are out begging in the streets for crust, while the hungry are getting second helpings. The barren woman has a house full of children, while the mother of many is bereft. God brings death and God brings life, brings down to the grave and raises up. God brings poverty and God brings wealth. He lowers, He also lifts up. He puts poor people on their feet again. He rekindles burned out lives with fresh hope, restoring dignity and respect to their lives, a place in the sun. For the very structures of earth are God's. He has laid out His operation on a firm foundation. He protectively cares for His faithful friends, step by step, but leaves the wicked to stumble in the dark. No one makes it in this life by sheer muscle. God's enemies will be blasted out of the sky, crushed in a heap, and burned. God will set things right all over the earth. He'll give strength to His king. He'll set His anointed on top of the world.
I have a daughter. When she was in high school, she had a Muslim friend. She still has the friend on Facebook. The friend would say to her, we have to pray about this. And they would pray together. She agonizes on Facebook now because of what's happening in her religion. My daughter has a daughter. She goes to school here in Calgary. She has a Muslim friend. It's always interesting to me that they're so attracted to one another because they have so much in common. The Muslim friend tells my granddaughter she's going to hell and invites her to come to her house and they play. Different scenario, isn't it? Now, relax. I'm going to take this someplace good. Okay? So don't get excited. This is called jihad in the 5th grade. These are our kids in the front line. Everything happens everywhere to everybody now. Have you noticed? And it all happens at once. I've been in majority Muslim countries. I'll never forget the first morning I woke up in one to the Muslim call to prayer. It had not occurred to me that this happens. 4 a.m. Somebody with a voice I have never heard before, and amplification sufficient to cover the entire town, issued the Muslim call to prayer and sat me bolt upright in bed looking for the clock radio. Where is that thing? And then it dawned on me, oh, I'm in a different place. That was in Africa. I have heard it also in Indonesia, in a majority Muslim place where you get to do this. You wake up the whole town at 4 a.m. and everybody gets up to pray. It occurred to me, if Christians lived under this, you would never hear anybody say again, I miss my devotions this morning. No, you don't. You're up, you're awake, and I thought, they're praying. I might as well, you know. Do you know what it's like to come to Canada from that? And never again, ever again, hear it and have the entire culture say to you over and over again, you're just one of the crowd. Christians have known what it is like to have lost the consensus of a culture. When all you take is a 12-hour plane ride and boom, you're there. It makes you want to look at somebody and say, you're going to hell. In fact, some of my friends who operate a friendship center in Edmonton have had Muslim people walk in and say, "You're going to hell." Because I think, with all due respect, some of them feel like they're already there themselves. And nobody's listening. Nobody's listening. There is a certain anguish that is expressed in that we need to hear. That's connected to the story I'm about to tell, but you're going to have to walk with me and trust me to connect the dots here this morning, okay? Because the story that we have before us is the story of Hannah, a woman in another kind of anguish, in another kind of situation that, yes, is related to this. For here is a woman who is, the old King James uses an awful word, barren. Now, if ever there was one human condition that has met with just about every kind of attitude you can think of, it's a woman's capacity to bear children. In my culture, there are two dominant approaches. One is to say, "Isn't that wonderful?" full of sentiment, and the other is contempt. You've been sloppy. I really have a problem with the way we deal with things in my culture. But in this one, on so many different layers, though we show contempt to this culture, woman's good for nothing but having babies. These cultures, this time, those women keep that culture alive. Let them just for one generation bear no children, and everything, including the promises of God, is over. For God, have you noticed, through the Bible, has a particular affection for changing times through the birth of a child. Sarah, Rachel, Hannah, Ruth, Isaiah, Elizabeth, Mary. So I don't scoff so much if the Bible thinks it's that serious. For here is a woman who understands that her place within a polygamous marriage is the perpetuation of that tribe, and she cannot bear children, and her compatriot, the other woman in the marriage, can, and rubs it in. A situation that has existed from before that time right up into our very day today. I've had students at Ambrose who have come children of women in polygamous relationships, one in particular whose mother died. And as soon as that happened, even though he is the son of the husband of that family, the other women drove that young boy out, and he lived in a tree. Literally, he lived in a tree. He owned two things. One was a briefcase that had come from his father, and one was a suit of underwear that he wore on special occasions. That was his only clothing when a Christian missionary encountered him at age 18. That's all he had to wear. So I don't blame this woman for feeling the edge and the vulnerability that comes. When she goes up to worship with her husband to Shiloh, he's an observant man. He offers sacrifices. And two things happen to her. One is he goes overboard to show her preference by giving her extra portions. But that's what they do with the sacrifices. They sit down and eat them. Even though you're asking yourself, she's there, no kids. What does she do with more? And it's patently obvious to the other woman who has many children that this one is favored. So the second thing that happens is the woman with children rubs it into the woman who doesn't. Not only that she doesn't, but that in this particular context, right here at the place of worship, she does it in the face of the promises of God to open the womb and give children to women and calves to cattle and so on. The promises of the book of Deuteronomy. Except for you. I can't imagine anything more galling, anything more anguish-building than to have to go up every year and know this is what it's going to be like. It's going home for Christmas to a family that you know is going to fight from the time you walk in the door until the time you end, and you'd rather be anywhere else. And then on top of that, I hope you don't mind if I acknowledge this, to have a husband look at you and say, am I not of more worth to you than 10 sons? I want to say to this husband, nice try. What you didn't say is you are of more worth to me than 10 sons. And an extra slice of beef doesn't really make a difference. Hannah, why are you crying? Why aren't you eating? So Hannah ate. On one particular occasion, who knows which one it was, she pulled herself together, slipped away quietly, and entered the sanctuary. Now, women today walk into church. Women in this day don't just slip into the sanctuary and say, hi, I'm here, don't mind me. And there is a priest on duty whose name is Eli. Now we know him, don't we, if we've read the Bible. He's corrupt. And when he looks at a woman in prayer, for she begins to weep, crushed in soul, cries inconsolably, and only moves her lips so that she's not making sounds other than weeping, praying inwardly and silently, finding that place inside where the well springs of the soul break up and gush and come out before God, and you can't stop it. And the first thing he thinks about is, you're drunk. Do you know why? Because that's the first thing he thinks about. That and food, we'll find that out about him. And so he says to her, you're drunk. Whereas she has made a vow. They couldn't be farther apart. And in the anguish of soul, finding, by the way, did you know this is why you pray? You pray to get down inside the depths of your soul where God has already been speaking. Find what he's saying in prayer. Pray something in concert with Almighty God. Most of us are afraid to go into our own souls because we know we'll find what's there. She found it. The guts of this woman just blow me away. Oh, God of the angel armies. Interesting name. God of the hidden strength. This will come out later. God whose power is unseen. Everybody writes it off. I don't see anything. It reminds me of the Facebook post that I saw this week where it says, pray for Paris. And he says, what good does praying do? I'm probably not going to be able to convince him of anything with a response on Facebook. But I dare him to go there. I dare him to go there. Where she has gone, God of the angel armies, if you'll take a good hard look at my pain. How many of us died and said, God doesn't care about my pain? Here is a woman in bitterness who does not pray from bitterness. There's a difference. Take a look at my pain. Anybody ever prayed that way? Most of us grew up with a God who said, you've got your pain, deal with it. Take a look at my pain. Take a hard look at my pain. And if you'll quit neglecting me and go into action for me, by giving me a son, I'll give him completely, unreservedly to you. I'll set him apart for a life of holy discipline, which I don't think is a bargain. I think it sounds like a sacrifice. In other words, I'm asking God to do something. God will be, therefore, upon whatever God does from that time to this, and even forward. By the way, it doesn't look like she asked her husband. She just walked right into the sanctuary and out of the depths of her soul said, God, I want this. You're the God of the angel armies. Do it, please. And if you're asking me, isn't this really kind of silly? God isn't involved in conception and pregnancy. Is he? My answer to that would be, anecdotally, yes. Seen it. But what I know from this story is that even though Eli approaches her thinking she's drunk and asking her to sober up, she has the strength to look a corrupt priest in the eye. This is the courage and the daring that comes when a soul learns to pray. If you've connected with God, connecting with another human being gets a little easier, especially if that other human being needs a little straightening out. I'm a woman hard used. I haven't been drinking. Not a drop of wine or beer. The only thing I've been pouring out is my heart, and I've been pouring it out to God. I love that expression. Don't for a minute think I'm a bad woman. I hate it that this woman has to defend her prayer in church. It's because I'm so desperately unhappy and in such pain that I've stayed here so long. Which means that she didn't take probably 2 seconds to get into the depths of her soul to find a prayer and then thrust it out. It took a while. And it was worth the while. And the priest has enough experience still left in him to answer her, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel give you what you have asked of him." And even the blessing of a corrupt priest lands upon her, and out she goes. As though God is saying, everything might be messed up in the big picture, but I can still listen to you in the small picture. So don't walk away dusting your hands off saying, what good is it to pray? Who would ever listen to me? Why are my thoughts about this of any consequence? What we really should be praying about is this whole corrupt system and ignore our own personal needs. It doesn't appear to be a problem. We have a woman who asked God to become pregnant and promised that God's holiness would enshroud that. And the priest said, "Oh, okay, then may God grant that." And out she went. And before the year was out, Elkanah slept with Hannah, his wife, and God began making the necessary arrangements. I'm thinking, I wonder what that would be like. The necessary arrangements in response to what she had asked. And I think what that refers to is not simply the pregnancy, but the circumstances under which this child, who will be called Samuel, the last of the great judges, Samuel, the first of the great prophets, Samuel, the man who helped Israel transition from a warlord status to a nation with a king, and will put before that nation the challenge. You want to be just like the nations. You ought to think better of that. And it will come to the kings and pronounce judgment on many of them. Huge political stuff, resting in the heart of one child not yet born. Before the year was out, she conceived and had given birth to a son. She named him Samuel, explaining, I asked God for it. That's what his name means. And when Elkanah next took his family on their annual trip to Shiloh to worship God, offering sacrifices and keeping his vow, Hannah didn't go. She told her husband, after the child is weaned, I'll bring him myself and present him before God, and that's where he'll stay for good. And Jacob, before the great forefather of Israel, had two women. One wife was barren, but he loved her, and the other had children, and she was loved less. The one whom he loved bore children, and he wanted to keep them, and broke his life open over trying to find them. Here is a man who let his children go, recognizing in the devotion of his wife, perhaps a devotion he himself did not have. He said, okay, then you do what you think is right. And she did. And in due time, when the child was weaned, and by the way, that would be years later than what we practice in our culture in terms of weaning children, she took him and presented him and made generous sacrifices, probably because they were going to take care of the child from this point on. And every time she went up there, she'd need to bring him food and clothing and so on. And there they practiced their own faith and sacrificed and praised God together. Gave the child to Eli. I can't imagine what that was like. And Hannah said to Eli, "Excuse me, sir, would you believe that I'm the very woman who was standing before you at this very spot, praying to God?" Whatever else was happening in that temple, there was honest praise from a clean heart coming from one woman who had prayed and asked God to do something in her life that would have consequences that exceeded anything any of them understood. And says over and over and over again a message that the Old and New Testament says: do not despise the day of small things. God's going to change things. He'll start with something you would look at and say, never happened. There, they worship God. Then that grand prayer that Tessie read, that almost seems too bold, full of hyperbole, exalted this and debased that, sent people away, and all of the rest of that sort of thing, comes out of the praise of a Semitic woman who's had an answered prayer. Wow. I love that. Please don't tell me that the Bible hates women or despises what they can do. But now I'd like to take this someplace just a little larger, if you'll permit me. Because Newfoundlanders have a phrase. I have never heard them say this, though I've heard them use the language, "Stay where you're at and I'll come where you're to." Have you heard that one? Okay. Colleen might be able to confirm this for me. She's close enough, but where you're at is where you're at. You know, we've learned to talk that where you're to is where somebody else is or where you're going. I remember a woman, a Newfoundlander, coming to my door and asking about an address and saying, I was wondering where that was to. I thought, I know where you're from. At and to, of covering distance that separates you from someplace else, can also apply to time as well as space. Where something's at and where it's to. In terms of time, this story is at a time in the great history of Israel when Israel lives in the land of promise, under warlords essentially, where it's to, that is, where the story is read, where it is intended in its current form to be received, is at the end of that history, a long period of time of failed kingships, resulting in the loss of the kingdom, the loss of land, the loss of citizenship, and if you stretch it far enough, exile, being deported, forced out, pushed away, refugees. Does this sound familiar to, like, the news this week? What in the world difference would it make to have a story about a little woman who doesn't have a baby and prays and gets pregnant and has a baby and gives it to a temple and he becomes a great man, to people who have lost everything she gave that child to? Gone. I'd like to answer that question and take us into the present. That time was a time of soul searching for an entire nation under God. And in that soul searching, three things emerged that gave them and us our future. Number one, a holy book emerged. This story is a part of it. The Bible wasn't there from day one. The Hebrew Old Testament and the Tanakh was not there from day one. And when you read about David, he couldn't read it and he didn't have it. It comes later. What was based on a temple and sacrifices here becomes based on a holy book there. What had its origin in Shiloh and coming up to make sacrifices once a year becomes rooted in a meeting that happens once a week in something called a synagogue. You with me still? And this is the one aspect of commonality that connects them. What happens there and here depends entirely not on what happens in the book or in the synagogue, but what happens in the home. Whether there is godliness, holiness, prayer, and a seeking after God at home that produces children who regenerate the faith over and over again, generation upon generation, that is found in the book and expressed in the synagogue. Am I making sense to you? And part of the reason for the collection of this story, so that it could be known by these people, was to create a religion for people who never go home, who were exiles forever. They called it not refugee status, but the diaspora, and the Jewish people, for that's how they came to be known. Not Israelites, but Jews. And I'm painting with an awfully huge brush. Scattered throughout the world, synagogues throughout the world, the Holy Torah, wrapped up and carried from place to place, kissed and touched as the touchstone of their faith, still observed today in this city, right here in Calgary, and around the world. By the way, do you know why we meet in places like this once a week to discuss a holy book called the Bible with the New Testament? That's why. Do you know why Muslims meet in a mosque once a week to discuss a holy book? That's why. If only we could acknowledge the enormous base of commonality that we have. The enormous base that we have. And take from this one story, this one truth. Faith lives or dies in the piety of a home, where hearts have learned to pray and manifest that. You can bring them to the meeting all you want. That's a good thing to do. Sunday school and so on. But where that piety does not come out around the table, in the choices that are made at home, the way people talk and treat one another, if it doesn't look Christian and sound Christian, that probably will stop with that generation. And where it is and where it does, history and the faith itself tells us it will carry on. When I was looking at a billboard in the University of British Columbia Student Union, a great whiteboard actually, where they had invited students to write words of wisdom that they had received from various places. I watched people write this saying, and it was, you were supposed to tell where you got it from. Gandhi. You know, here's another one. Martin Luther King. Here's another one. Dag Hammarskjöld. Here's another one. Zoroaster. Here's another one. Jesus Christ. And one right in the middle stuck with me forever. I can't even remember what it said, but I do remember what it was signed as. My mum. That's what I'm talking about.